Detective Ridge, besides just playing, the little boys, had they been in the water? Did they get into the water with you all? The supposition was that the little boys had got into the water. Was that an incorrect supposition? Did he correct him? He says, no, they did not get into the water with us. He corrects him. Does the very thing that the defense's own expert says that you would do when you're confessing, and not a coerced confession. He then says that in a confession, uncoerced, that you have, in there they relate conversations with co-defendants. Do you have that in this case? Well, the proof was that before the tape, he admitted that he was present, the tape was started, that there was a telephone call from Jason Baldwin to this defendant. And in this phone call, Damien is in the background saying something to the effect of, tell him we're going to get some girls. And he says, hey, I know what's going on. Do you think if the guy's going to make up something, he's going to make up dialogue of something like that? Or would Mr. Alshay say that they manipulated him into saying that? On page 3, again, remember one of the things the defense's own expert says is you'll have conversations between the co-defendants. The defendant on page 3 says, he called me, asked me could I go to West Memphis with him. I told him no, I had to work and stuff. And then he told me he had to go to West Memphis. So him and Damien went. The conversations between the co-defendants. On page 6, conversations. Says he took off running, went home. Then they called me, asked me how come I didn't stay. I told them I just couldn't. Again, the very things that the defense's expert says that you find in an uncoerced confession. And then page 12, you've got the telephone call where he says, we've done it. What are we going to do if somebody saw us? All conversations with co-defendants. He then says, another factor is that there's something that corroborates the confession. Now, is there anything in this case that corroborates the confession? Anything at all? Think about it. Number 1, Tabitha Hollingsworth. She testifies, and her testimony was not challenged one iota. She testifies that her mother and her rest of her family are going to pick up grandmother, aunt, whatever, some relation. And on the way there, between or about Blue Beacon Truck Wash, you know the woods are just to the side, y'all know all about the crime scene, that they see, walking along the service road, Damien and his girlfriend, Dominique. And do you remember how she described the clothing? Said they were muddy. She also said that they were wearing black and that Dominique had holes in her knees. You remember that? You got it in your notes, refer back. Think back about that. Holes in the knees. Now, what did the defendant say about what Jason was wearing? All black, one of these shirts with the skull on it. And it's in the tape about what he's wearing. And how does he describe the pants that he's wearing? Said he had holes in the knees. At night, along the service road, Dominique's got red hair. Jason Baldwin, slightly built, long hair, pants with holes in the knees. That's one thing that corroborates the confession. You've got Damien. You've got him at the scene by Tabitha's testimony, and you also have the testimony of Lisa Sakavicius, that's the right pronunciation, about the fibers. The fibers that were taken from one of the victims' clothing that were consistent with having come from this one shirt out of Damien's house. The testimony was that she checked fibers at the victims' houses, she checked fibers at Jason's, Damien's, the defendant's. And out of all that, one article of clothing, the fibers matched. Sure, they can say, well, those fibers, as the witness said, well, it could have come from a similar type garment from the same batch of dye. But out of all those houses, you get one garment that matches. Then, on Jason, again, you have a fiber that matches. The only match out of all the clothing in all those houses. The only match. Is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence that the defendant describes Jason as having pants with holes in his knees and wearing all black? And then Tabitha saying, well, I see Damien and Dominique, his girlfriend, and just so happens she's got holes in her knees? Is that a coincidence? Then we get to something that corroborates it, which is another thing Mr. Holmes says about some inconsequential matter. I think the way he described it was somebody walking by or some conversation or something. Do you remember what the defendant said in his statement about what he did with his tennis shoes and what kind of tennis shoes they were? He said that he gave them to a guy named Buddy Lucas. And he describes in his statement that they were white and blue Adidas. Detective Ridge testified that he went to Buddy Lucas's, and lo and behold, what did he get from Buddy Lucas? The white and blue Adidas. Is that a coincidence? I think not. Then you get to further corroboration, the injuries. When in discussing, and listen, you have the right to listen to those tapes as many times as y'all want to. Listen to those tapes. Don't rely on what I say they say, or what Mr. Stidham or Mr. Crow says, or what Mr. Davis says. You go back there and listen to those tapes. Listen for the inflection in the voice. Listen for the yawns to show the tremendous pressure he was under in this interview. But when you listen to it, what you're going to find is they ask him. It says something about a boy, and where was the person cut? He says, in the face. Now, in all this stuff that Mr. Stidham put on about this knowledge, the stuff in the paper about that they were all sexually mutilated and that kind of thing, nothing in there about a boy being cut in the face. They were beat up real bad, but nothing in there about somebody being cut in the face. He says, yes, one of them was cut in the face. And then they say, well, where was another boy cut? At the bottom. Ends up, he says, in the area of the groin area. Now, is all of that just coincidence that he says that? Or is it, as Mr. Alshay says, that somehow these devious officers manipulated this defendant into saying things that weren't true? You've also got another factor. That's the ears. The defendant tells about the kids being grabbed by their ears. And you heard the medical examiner's testimony. Whatever the purpose for grabbing the ears, this defendant, in his statement, says they were grabbed by their ears. And if you'll look at that, you'll see that's exactly what he says. And Inspector Gitchell testified that before he actually said it, he was even demonstrating it. And what do we have from the medical examiner? You've got damage to his ears, bruised ears, consistent with having been grabbed. You've got 3 guys supposed to be involved in this. The defendant, Damien, and Jason. How many weapons did the medical examiner say that he could put a minimum number on? 3. At least 2 club-type weapons. I mean, you don't have to be an expert to look at these photographs and know that those injuries were not caused by similar type things. It's obvious that these were caused by a smaller object, these by a larger object. And then you have the knife. Is it a coincidence again that we've got 3 weapons? He also says that, and this is in a sense corroboration of what he says in his statement. Mr. Holmes says that it's natural for a person to try to lessen their involvement. Out of all 3 of these kids, for the defendant to associate with himself with, as far as one that he dealt with, which one did he pick? He picked Michael Moore, right? Which of the 3 boys didn't have any torture type or mutilation to them? Michael Moore. Is that coincidence? Or did the police somehow say, well, this would be a good scenario here. We'll get him to admit to it, but we'll only have him involved with one of them that wouldn't hurt too bad. No. It's not coincidence. It's not an accident. It's not a guess. It's telling what he knew, despite his faulty memory and his gas huffing and alcohol abuse. And while we're talking about that, if you recall Dr. Riker testifying about the effects of the faulty memory and the things you remember and won't remember, the things that you remember are the significant things. This was over a month later. Or, excuse me, it wasn't over. It was about a month later. Which details is he right on? The most traumatic, terrible events. Which ones is he wrong on? 2 things, time and rope. Are those the significant things that a person with memory deficits is going to remember and have branded in their mind? I think not. In regard to time, and it was somewhat pointed out this morning in Inspector Gitchell's testimony, there's an interesting statement in here by the defendant. He's saying this noon stuff and 9 o'clock in the morning and all that. On page 12, and listen to this. When you get back there, again, make sure that you ask to listen to the tape and get it to this spot. And you look and you'll see that nobody has said anything about, hey, it happened at night or anything like that. And you're going to hear Jessie say, well, after all of this stuff happened that night, that they done it, I went home about noon. Absolutely makes no sense at all, but you'll hear those words come out of his mouth. Is it because we've got somebody that doesn't have any concept of noon? It's not words put in his mouth. It's not anything from a question that was asked to him. Those are his words. Well, after all of this stuff happened that night, was that some kind of a slip? Why did he say that? He's the one who first says about it happening that night. Then we get to Dr. Wilkins. He described the defendant as a gas huffer, heavy alcohol user, pot smoker. And then you see the defendant throughout this trial. And you ask yourself, and you listen to these experts and you say, who's being deceptive? Is it Inspector Gitchell and Detective Reeves when they say, look, we just talked to the guy, we let him talk, we took his information, and when we found out, and when we realized that he was identifying injuries to particular people that only a person that was there and involved knew, we knew we had our man. Now, are they the ones being deceptive? Who's being deceptive? This is the person that was there on May the 5th. The bright eyes, the clear eyes, that is the person that was there on May the 5th. Not the person that you've been observing, allowed to observe throughout this trial. Who's being deceptive in this case? Dr. Wilkins claims that this defendant is suggestible. Remember when he was asked, well, did you do some kind of test? Or was there any test that showed that? There's no basis for his opinion other than his general conclusion that he's suggestible. And remember what Dr. Reichard said about being suggestible? And how you'd need to know whether the person had a memory problem because that could affect whether they're being suggested to or they just don't remember. Remember that? Dr. Wilkins himself testified that this defendant had significant memory deficits. Then we get to Mr. Alshay, or Dr. Alshay, as whichever one you prefer. But Dr. Alshay, or Mr. Alshay, he can't treat a broken arm. He can't treat your mind. He's not a licensed psychologist. You can't be licensed as a social psychologist. He's a professor and a professional witness. And I will say this. As Mr. Davis said, he's earned our respect. He is an expert witness. An expert at testifying. You observed him. Do you believe that he would have even agreed that Mr. Davis's shirt is white if he had asked him? He probably would have wanted to explain his answer. Just because you hold yourself out as an expert in something doesn't make you an expert. Just because you come in with a lot of degrees and a Pulitzer Prize. But as you heard Dr. Reichard, it may as well have been the Heisman Trophy. The Pulitzer Prize has no relevance to scientific testimony. None. He's from Berkeley, California, and he came and put on a show. And it was, from my standpoint, pretty entertaining. May not have been too entertaining for Brent, but it was pretty entertaining to watch this expert at testifying testify. Last year, he earned $40,000 just going around testifying. And how many times could he recall ever testifying on behalf of the prosecution? Not one. And you might say, well, but the prosecution obviously wouldn't want him to come up here and testify. Obviously wouldn't want him to come up and testify that it's a coerced confession. But, why, he says 40% of the time that he looks at these things that he finds are not coerced. Well, don't you think out of that 40% or whatever percent he said, that one time the prosecution would have said, well, they're challenging the voluntariness of the confession. Would you come testify for us? No, he only testifies for the defense. Of course, he claims that, he doesn't make much money, but he made $40,000. Charges $300 an hour, but he's never gotten it. I mean, isn't that what he said? Says he charges $300 an hour, but had never been paid that much. I think he values himself more than what he's really worth. But let's talk about the substance. And I've talked a lot about his qualifications, and I think y'all are acutely aware of what the proof is about that. But what he boiled down his opinion to was his problem was about the same problem that Mr. Holmes said. Just had a problem with that time. Of course, Mr. Holmes says that the time thing was cleared up in the second interview. But Mr. Alshey spends all his time talking about the time problem. Now, I want you to think, and you use your own memory. Don't rely on what I say. Use your own memory. What scientific basis did he give for concluding that any of that statement was coerced?